Hello, everybody. It's Jeff Allen. Yes, Jeff Allen. And I'm going to be doing a video here on how do you pronounce those three letters on the bottom of my badge. Those three letters. Now, this is a big question that makes people lose sleep a lot in the debate. But the first thing I need to do is I need to walk through and explain a couple of terms, words and what they are, and give some examples. And we'll get to this at the end because this is the hard one. So the first thing is people say, is this an acronym? Is this an abbreviation? Or what is this thing? Well, let's go through and have a few examples. So we have the first thing is, what is a true abbreviation? A true abbreviation versus a suspension. You haven't even heard the word suspension before, yeah? A true abbreviation, what is it? It's like the word INV with a dot, INV for invoice. What is, you start with the beginning of the word and then you kind of put a dot and you don't finish the end of the word, right? So INV dot for invoice, or the word ENG dot for engineer. That's an abbreviation because the dot stops it from the beginning. It's a shortened form from the beginning, usually a few letters. Now, what is this? And then etc. But the problem is, etc., you have to pronounce the whole thing, right? It's ETC, for etc. Okay? So those are examples of true abbreviations. Now, what is a suspension? Slightly different. A suspension, usually this gets kind of mixed up. A suspension is that you've got a middle part of the word that's actually removed. We got other words for this in linguistics, but I don't want to go through those. I don't want to get into this kind of, we get to all these other terms that you wouldn't need to know, but like HZ dot is for hertz. You know, the frequencies, hertz. Or actually you can do that maybe for the car rental company too, but hertz. Then DR period or dot is for doctor, because you don't pronounce, like in hertz, you don't pronounce the middle of it. And doctor, you don't pronounce several of the letters between the D and the R, right? So that's called a suspension, because you're suspending the pronunciation from you start with the beginning, you get to the end, it's pronounced in the middle, okay? So that's what the suspension is. Now, what now is an acronym? Now, this is a shortened form where you've got the initial letters, they begin a pronounceable word. Okay, so the initial letters begin this pronounceable word. So let's give you a couple examples of this. PIN, P-I-N, PIN. You don't say P-I-N, you say PIN for the personal identification number, right? It's for kind of like your code PIN on your credit card or something, right? PIN number. NASA for the National Aeronautics Space Administration. DARE, D-A-R-E. Sometimes you actually use existing words in the dictionaries to say that. So DARE is for the Drug Abuse Resistance Education. Now there's another one, and this is where I'll get this one at the end here, because this one's a better one here. Now initialisms. This is a specific word, which is what usually people think are acronyms, but they're not acronyms. And initialism is where you've got, it's kind of like an acronym, but usually you speak out each letter one by one. So the NFL for National Football League, or the NBA for Basketball Association, or the ATM for automated teller machine, or USA, or IBM, or URL, or the places I have studied or worked at universities, PSU and CMU and IU. Those are all what we call initialisms, okay? Because you're spelling them out letter by letter. Now, what are a couple of rules about this? At least in American English, a lot of the governmental agencies or some of the military kind of branches or divisions, they're usually what we're going to call these initialisms, because you say FBI or ATF or USAF or DHS or SAS or OSS, okay? And also some of the things that executive C-suite positions in companies, you're always going to say CEO, COO, CFO, CIO, CTO, CMO, right? So they're all spelled out. Whereas you could kind of pronounce them if you wanted to, but they're not. Now there's some of these that are called in the know. Got to be in the know, because what happens is you you start by thinking you got to pronounce it letter by letter, and you find out you got to actually pronounce it. Or it's actually kind of a mixed version of the suspensions, like a double suspension. So the three letters SQL, people that don't know, like computer, if they're not computer programming, they'll see SQL and they'll say, I got to pronounce SQL. But no, people that know this, it's called sequel. Sequel. You got to pronounce it. So that's kind of a double suspension. It's a double suspension word, okay? That's really a tricky one. Got to be in the know. Um, yeah, I call this a double suspension. I've just invented a new category, a subcategory, a double suspension, because it's sequel. So you're missing the SEQUEL, double suspension of that, okay? Um, or we could actually play with that, and yeah, that's how I call it a suspension. And another one I just found here was you've got the four letters XAML. Now, people will sometimes say XAML, but people that are in the know, after you've like said it once wrong and people correct you, then you got to know this is their JAML or SHAML, depending on who you're talking to, right? So it kind of depends. Um, so again, we're going to come back to that example of how do you pronounce those three letters on my card. This is the fun one. Well, it's kind of in the know, and it depends. I'm going to call this it all depends. And yes, I'm going to give us an example. It all depends. So if you're going to, I remember before I came to work for this company, I worked in a previous company where we actually did some implementations of it, but we didn't know. And so I called it SAP, SAP, SAP before I came to the company. But then I came to work for the company 13 years ago. And the first thing that you learn today on the first day is called SAP. Yes, it is not an acronym, a pronounceable acronym. It is an initialism. It's initialism. Now, except that's when it's the company name. But if you begin using it in different contexts, like the SAP glossary on the SAP help portal, SAP glossary as an adjective, there is still spelled out as initialism. But then it starts getting a little more tricky when you've got the SAP terminology database. SAP term. Oh, now it's an acronym when it's joined with another part of a word to talk about the database. And there's also an internal thing called Sapedia. Yeah, oh boy, we got that too. So it all depends, and you got to know. So this is an in the know, all depends. This is actually another subcategory because it's a dual version of this. Now the big question that everybody says is, wait a second. Now when we're writing this, do you have to put the word a or an before using those three letters? Well, it all depends again, right? And it all depends on how you pronounce it. Some people all think because it's all about writing. It's not about writing, it's about the spoken. So this comes back to linguistics, and this is called phonetics, and it's actually called phonology. It's a little more detailed than phonetics, because phonetics is just the sounds. Phonology is how they combine together when you begin to make words out of them, or combining sounds across words, okay? This gets kind of geeky, but I'm kind of trying to make fun here. So do you put an A or you put an an as the this indefinite article it's called before those three letters? Well, it all depends, because if it's just the three letters, well, you'd have to have it, because you can't just say SAP, because it doesn't work. You got to have SAP something, right? So I've got, well, only got one. I'm gonna pretend that we have more than one, because you'd say an SAP glossary if there were several. Okay, if there are several of them, it's an SAP glossary. and we're going to go to, we're going to have a SAP term database. Wait a second. So it's an SAP glossary, but it's a SAP term database or a SAP term entry. Okay. Why do we do that? Because it's not about writing, it's about pronunciation. That's the important thing. So it all depends on the sound because it's all phonological. The the letters, when you pronounce them individually, the letter S is not actually a consonant when you're pronouncing it because it starts with S. S. Is in the vowel. Sorry about that, a vowel. So it's an S. You gotta have an n. You gotta have an S. That's why it's SAP. So you gotta have that. You gotta have that nasal consonant to make the liaison over to SAP. It's not pronounced S, except in the case where you say SAP term, a SAP term entry, because SAP term begins with S, which is basically that consonant, that sibilant consonant S. Okay, so it all depends how you pronounce it and not how you write it. Okay, and that's going to be your homework to do it, because always finish with having a call to action. I want you to write down everything of an example you can think of using those three letters, the three separate letters SAP, but in all the combinations you ever said. And I want you need to make sentences making these things, even if it doesn't exist, it doesn't matter. Like I said, an SAP glossary, an SAP glossary entry. Hey, that would work. An SAP glossary entry, or an SAP glossary definition, or a SAP term definition. See, it's kind of this thing. It gets kind of fun. So all you word lovers, you're gonna have a little bit of fun, and now you'll be able to not lose so much sleep in actually learning how to pronounce these letters. And now you can sound even more like you are in the know, because I've just told you how to do it. It took me 13 years to figure this out. No, I actually figured it out in the first year because they had to get teaching by get taught by the right people. That's the in the know version, based on the linguistic discussion and definition of what all these things are. Remember, so there's a difference between a true abbreviation, a suspension, an acronym, an initialism, and in the know. And we have dual suspensions, in the know, and we have the it all depends. So you heard that from me, and this is. I hope you had fun with this, because I had fun too.